Hello. Welcome all to this edition of Architecture and Society. It's the same program, the same sort of message, slightly different form of seating. At the request of our speaker today, who, it's about movements in any case. And it's about the fact that as citizens, we need to actually be a little more responsible about our capacity to do things in public life. It's a kind of rather strange idea, except not strange to Jai, who's been doing this for such a long time. And at one of the earlier meetings of our talks, this gap in our public behavior seemed to become very evident. So I suddenly remembered that Mr. Sen is one of our old hands at this game. And he has agreed today to be here. I'm told straight off the aeroplane and across the country, etc., etc. But it's very kind of you to come and talk to us. I don't want to give a long, an introduction. I think there's a short introduction which is given in the poster or the flyer or the information that's gone around. And that's really quite enough. Jai is an architect by training, and I think he'll explain himself what he does. He does work with social movements and has been doing so for some time. So I'll just leave him to take the floor, as they say. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Pick this up. Hello, everybody. Thank you, Ashish, for inviting me. I really appreciate this gesture. I did train and I did practice as an architect, and I suppose in that sense I would be a lapsed architect. But for many years I continued. If you like, I dropped out of mainstream architecture in '73 or so. Architecture and urban design practice, because I was frustrated with the practice as an experience and wanted to re-educate myself, or to try and understand how ordinary people understand architecture, how ordinary people understand housing, which I was particularly interested in. And I embarked on that journey, but continued to regard myself as an architect, even though by the 80s I had definitely moved into what might be called dematerialized architecture. And in many ways I continued. Even '89, I remember there was a talk, I was by mistake called by the Institute of Architects to be one of the special speakers, because Laurie Baker was being given gold medal, and until they realized that I wasn't registered. But anyway, it was too late. I was already up there on the podium, where I talked, I talked about architecture as struggle. But I think many of you will understand that. I mean, I think in design, in work that we do, there is struggle. It's not that it is there, but I was trying to bring it part of social struggle. And that I see architecture as only a manifestation of the social relations of society. So in that sense, the title of this series, the Architecture and Society, for me, the interest is the architecture of society and how that manifests itself, among other things, in built forms. That's something I explore separately. I'm not going to try and do it here. But what I mean to say this, why I say this, is because I have regarded myself as an architect for many, many years, right through to the '90s, when I broke out of activism and moved into research. And one of the fellowships I was fortunate to get was on the architecture of social movement, and et cetera, et cetera. So you can see that my search, if you like, has continued. And for me, it's a pleasure. In this last year or so, I've been dug out of the debris and been invited to 2, 3, or 4 occasions, the debris of history. And it's been good for me to engage again with people who are practicing live architecture, and to talk and to engage with ideas. So I see this as one more opportunity, so thank you for that chance. I've mentioned this to Ashish that, in fact, I'd like to even invite people, if you'd come and sit in the front row. I see this less of a talk and more, if you like, something of a workshop. Ideally, as I was trying to plow through my thoughts, it would have been something of a longer time period. It's certainly where many of us could share, where we could break out groups to do a variety of things, come back together. But that's not going to be possible this evening. But nevertheless, I will try some of that. I'd like to, because and I'll come to specific points. It's in a way, I realized once I got into it, I'm not even sure I'm terribly well qualified to be talking about. And I'll explain why. So I'd like also the views of people who are here, so we can build it and maybe possibly even make it part of an ongoing conversation where we can have other such sessions. It's not doesn't have to stop here or even in the series like we do just separately. Those of us who are interested talk about this more. Then I repeat my invitation. Anyone would like to come to the empty seats in the front row, it'd be nice, so we can, not to kind of embarrass people who want to leave quickly from the back seats, but that's, I know that's always an urge, and it's a strategic location. So I'm going to take the liberty here of, no, there's one more thing I want to say. If you find that I suddenly flag an energy, please excuse me. I've been through an emotionally very tough couple of weeks. I've just come, and I'm not literally off the flight, but I sort of went home, washed up, came here. But I've just been with family who are extremely unwell. So, and that happens, we all know it. But it's been a searing experience in this last week. So when I landed, I realized that this wasn't a very good juxtaposition, landing, feeling your mind kind of scorched, and you're trying to talk. So I might, at some point, flag. I hope I don't go to sleep, but I will do my best to keep the energy going. But please excuse me. So I'm going to take the liberty of repeating, in a sense, what Ashish wrote to ask me to do. And I think you'll immediately understand. I mean, I'm just going to literally take it from his text. It seems that people are nowadays not coming together to form collectives and to take action on public issues, even when there are clearly strong feelings about such issues. I think one issue was the issue of the lopping, chopping, and decimation of trees in the city, but I'm sure there are other issues. Another point was nowadays groups like Avaz are able to unite people globally to influence public policy, it seems to me. Third, is there a better way to take collective action in today's connected world? And then he said, what he said already, your experience in formulating collectives X, Y, Z were significant moves, and it seemed that you might be able to throw some light on this. So one of the things that I wanted to say it from the beginning, and I am responding to this in a sense, excuse me, everybody turned their phone to silent, is that no, let me start. This is an add-on, that's why I can't read my own writing. I'd just like to ask people here, how, if many of you have been involved in, if you like, public action, either in terms of demonstrations, like Take the Night Back, many of us were involved, and some of you may have been involved at that time, or in online activism, or any other forms that you might have. I'm just get an idea of how familiar people are with the concept of campaigns and movements and the practice. In terms of online activism, can I get some idea of showing of hands? Yeah, that sort of stuff.
That kind of stuff.
Yeah, yes.
Part in something like Not in My Name.
That's her.
Like was a response to the lynching.
Right.
Not taking any kind of lead, just participating.
Rotating, okay. Signing petitions. Acha. Okay. All right. Well, all right. We're getting there.
There was a protest in our college when a fire broke out in one of the rooms.
Uh-huh.
So I think there are a few more people who were a part of that.
About conditions in the
About
college.
conditions
Acha.
in the college.
Okay. Okay. Well, any other, I mean, we don't let you do a head count, but just to get some idea of things.
Yeah, signing these petitions.
Signing petitions?
I think there was the Aravali Biodiversity Park and the new proposed roads. There was a petition. There was a group of people coming together who actually have worked on it. So I was a part of it.
Okay.
But it was just one day. Yeah.
Anybody else?
Taking 600 kids to the park.
Oh, you did? That's good.
Acha. Okay. Anybody would like to add any I mean, it's already a smattering of, I mean, a fair degree of connectedness in terms of things. So, I mean, meaning that a personal experience is important. If it, for instance, was absent or more or less absent, which is unlikely, I think, today's world. I think Change.org or Avaz or something seem to reach all of us. So.
I was a member of a resident welfare association for 1 year.
Acha, okay.
And after 1 year, I got so frustrated that I withdrew from there.
All right.
Because there was nothing in common between what I suggested and what they wanted to do.
Well, this is an important contribution because I think these are some of the issues that, I mean, it's contained in this question of, well, and I don't want to make a secret of it, as I'm saying, that being in movement is not an easy task. It's very tough. Involves enormous social skills and patience. Please.
I tried telling people at Noida City Center Metro Station, that the space for the number of public, it's less and it's not built properly.
Achha.
I mean, the space-wise.
Okay.
Because there's a possibility that there could be another sort of incidents can happen.
Because of the crowds coming
overcrowd.
in. Yeah, okay. All right. And how did you do this? By talking to the manager or?
No, actually I faced the problem because I was in rush and I faced the problem, so I went to the office, their office at Noida City Center only, and I registered this complaint as a suggestion to them. And then few people called me up from Delhi Metro, from DMRC or something. And then I told them that this is the issue which is happening and you should find a solution to it.
And are you an architect by chance?
Yes.
Did you identify yourself as an architect? Like somebody who's familiar with
I'm an
space
architect.
planning. So, but did you tell them?
Yeah, I told them, but I don't think so it matters to them.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, I mean, all this is useful to service. Okay. Yes, please.
Currently trying to do public participation to try and improve the conditions through RWAs and all the other organizations to create a better environment and a neighborhood. I don't know where it's going to go. We've just started the process.
I
I'm
see.
very, very
With
hopeful.
in RWAs generally across Delhi.
No, it's a particular neighborhood. So
particular
taking a particular neighborhood,
neighborhood.
taking all the organizations together, creating a momentum where providing a forum for people to voice their concerns.
Okay.
We've just started it, don't know how it's going to go, but we're all very excited about it and going ahead with it right now.
Well, I mean, I think we've got a fair idea from each other also that we know who's here, but it also gives us material for continuing conversation, like, you know, your reporting, maybe the attempt you made with Metro, whether it has any impact, etc. I mean, I think there are different things. I think we would need that in order to carry a conversation forward. It has to be material based on reality. So anyway, thanks for responding. So as I said, when I tried putting my mind to the questions that Ashish raised, I realized that actually there's a big difference. It was very educative for me to confront these questions, that because as opposed to, you know, people nowadays are not coming together. In my experience, you know, for whatever, you know, it's worth, was always where people wanted to come together, where we were, and so trying to put myself in a situation where people didn't want has meant trying to get out of the box that I've inhabited and am familiar with. So that was interesting and difficult thinking. And secondly, what was also very important, there was already something which was usually actually existing conditions. The conditions, I worked for many years on issues of housing and dwelling. So the living conditions of people, of the urban living poor, were such that compelled action, I mean, for instance, evictions or the denial of services, of fundamental services such as water or health services, were things that compelled people to bring together just to survive. So it's a somewhat different situation, and so forgive me if I sometimes stray back into kind of assuming that there's compulsions which push us, because I think when they're not compulsions, it makes things a little more open, and I think it requires a different kind of vocabulary. As I said, I think this is very important to bear in mind, that this question of how does one tackle how and why people are not wanting to come together. And I think there's some clues that I'll try and offer, and I think we can, but I'd like to take this even as a beginning of a workshop where we talk together, and I'll be breaking what I say periodically to get feedback, and then to go forward. I'll try and build on what you say. So I've already said that public action is a tough task. It's even if you are compelled, even if you are, come and fill front seats, please. You're a front seat person, you know that. It demands, at the minimum, a very sustained investment. It doesn't come about easily. There's no silver bullet that I know of that brings it about, or it takes, and particularly successfully. So, I mean, that's one general task. Part of it is this issue of social skills, of hanging together and trying to work. Part of it has to do with circumstances become tougher or are different to what you think they are, and therefore you have to change your tactics. So that is one thing. The second thing that I think is that very important to bear in mind is that the nature of the times, the context that we live in. Now, I'm going to here go and sort of to what Ashish said that I might do is introduce myself in terms of what experience I'm coming from, and I'm going to contextualize that also. Partly I'm doing that because I can do it comfortably, but it will also, I think, become useful to do for you to realize how much the world has changed. So my work was primarily in the 1970s, 80s, early 90s. I know it's a long time ago, so I mean, by definition, a lot has happened, but it's actually astonishing. The 3 or 4 examples that Ashish mentioned, one was the building of a social action organization named Unnayan, which means development in the sense of unfolding or self-realization in Bengali, in Calcutta, working with the laboring poor. We formed this as a voluntary organization, not a movement as such, but it actually laid seed. We didn't realize this would happen. It seeded many things that happened in the city and more widely in the state and even in the country. And it wasn't the only such voluntary effort. There were several others in the country that, not several, I mean, it's within double digits of such organizations that formed in the late 70s that played this seeding role. The second, we did, there were a bunch of architects there, 2 are present here, in fact, Katie is here and Raka is here, who came and joined Unnayan at that time. There were 2 or 3 architects, then more came. And it became actually a clutch of architects among social activists and organizers, etc. And for a while, in fact, there was quite a lot of architecture going on in the more material sense of the word, as well as the non-material. Then our work moved on more into issues of rights, and architects who were more interested in doing more physical work also moved on. It was an intense period of 3, 4, 5 years where we had. We also did, it was direct community organization among refugees, among laboring poor. That led us to working in terms of organizing rickshaw pullers and raising the question of challenging the way the city was being planned and taken forward. It became the first major campaign we did, of the rights of the laboring poor to their livelihoods. You cannot remove their rights. The government planned to remove a lack of jobs just overnight. And we said that's impossible, and challenged it at a number of levels, from the courts to on the street to getting trade unions to form new, more active trade unions. The ones that were there were all left party oriented and who were paralyzed because the left was in power. So it was a rich period. Then we moved into issues of housing, dwelling, and dwelling rights. And we were instrumental in two things, two major initiatives. One was helping set up build a mass organization in the city called the Chinnumul Shramjeevi Adhikar Samiti, which formed about 84. It was a platform of community organizations struggling with the right. Thirdly, we were involved with the, with the building of something called the National Campaign for Housing Rights in the country, which is a much more broad-based thing. Some of you were involved and came in and out of that over those years, from about 85 through 92. It involved certainly architects and engineers and planners, but also environmentalists, feminists, tenants, slum dwellers, refugees, feminists, environmentalists, etc., very, very wide, broad coalition, basically around the demand that housing, a place to live in security and dignity, must be a fundamental right. And it brought that language into political vocabulary as well as social vocabulary and technical vocabulary, and in a wide variety of fields. And so that was the second thing. And the third was that I was subsequently involved, aside from being involved with a number of related experiences in the 80s and 90s, such as Lokayan, the Narmada Bachao Andolan, Jan Vikas Andolan, and with a campaign in the 90s for building alternative economic policies. I was later involved with building of the World Social Forum in India and then internationally. I think some of you may know that, know of it. It was a extraordinary idea that was born in Brazil. It had one major event in India, in Mumbai in 2004, where basically it's an open space. And it's the architecture of this kind of movement that's very important. It was conceptualized as being an open space in political terms, but also manifested in physical terms and in programmatic terms, where it's not like a conference. It's a much more open-ended session with many sessions taking place simultaneously. So it was political deliberation across all kinds of isms, and it became an extremely rich crucible for the development of new ideas from 2001 through to about 2015, or in many, many parts of the world, and inspired, particularly in closed societies such as Iraq, Syria, Tunisia, even Pakistan briefly. There were social forums that were born that provided, like, pushed open space, brought some space, not open space, but more open than normal society provides, where both women and men could freely take part. So these are radical steps in terms of the architecture of politics. So these are some of the things I was involved in. But why am I saying this? I'm saying this because this happened, particularly the majority of it happened at a time where conditions were very different. Government was then still very different. It was the time when more sectarian, more even authoritarian government began to emerge. We experienced it in Bengal very strongly, but also elsewhere. But as you know, widely it has become the rage of the day across the country today, and intolerance, and it spreads in the polity. And we can see the violence in front of us everywhere. And that is, I mention this here because that's a context within which one does public campaign. And so there's intimidation is very common today if you take public positions that are not popular with those who, let's say, are more conservative. Trolling, obviously, on social media is there. And life, as you widely know, is made miserable. So the media with which you use, we didn't have social media in those days, and I'll come to that, but this kinds of vengeance, this kind of hate, this kind of mental violence that we experience today was all but absent at that time. And it was not there. For instance, we at Unnine had to face it from the left government. We were I was hauled up for sedition at that time. I mean, there was 4 things that we did. So it's not like it was not there. And you were intimidated by actions such as that. We were as a group. But by and large, government was very different. In that sense, to the extent that the state and the government is so important in our context, and particularly for all of you who live in Delhi, we have 3 tiers of government. It's extremely important, like you're always having to negotiate these spaces. Secondly, thirdly, the role, scale, and influence of private corporations was all but non-existent at that point. Today, again, we know that the huge influence that this takes, but through the state, as well as using access to, for instance, data and manipulating situations. So that's an entirely new actor in a very, very big way. And the kind of wealth that is concentrated among some of the industrialists and power that they have over the public sphere is enormous. It's like unthinkable at that point to imagine that there was anything of that kind. We just didn't exist. It's equally true of religious institutions. They did not have the rule of the roost as they do today. And in different parts of the country, different religions. That was just not there. It was not actively there. We could see them rising, but it never rose in quite the same way. As I said, there was no social media available, but with the one huge exception, and this is not the place to explore it, of groundswell. As much as today, where groundswell plays such an important role, such as the Me Too movement, since it's using social media, is that equally we had that at that time. And this is, I think, a part that's often understood since around the Mandal Commission report, or there were many, many other such things that happened. It is something that's often not understood as movement because social scientists have spent much less attention paying to open-ended groundswells. They don't even quite conceptualize it as movement in the same way. And in short, social scientists are being left behind in terms of things. And in my work, by the way, I'm here also to plug commercially a couple of books. If anyone's interested, not here, I'm not allowed to sell them, but one's called The Movements of Movements, What Makes Us Move. These are collections of a collection of essays from people from around the world reflecting on what is it that motivated them, motivates us to move. Starting with a very beautiful poem by an Indian Kenyan by the name of Shalja Patel. The second one is called The Movements of Movements, Rethinking Our Dance. And I'm using the word dance here, drawing from the First Nation, the indigenous peoples of North America, Turtle Island as they call it, where for them, as for indigenous cultures all over the world, dance is not only physical, but it's cosmological in terms of your relationship and through energy to the wider world. So and as obviously is so true in our context too. So it's using that these 2 collections. If anyone's interested, later please come and sign up and I can get the publisher to send them to you. That you can deal with that yourself. The third one is just to make it more impressive. They're 2 of the same one. Sorry. So here, in this, I try and put forward concepts, hopefully breaking boundaries about new ways of conceptualizing movement. I'm going to take a side here. If you think about the word movement, it exists almost in every sphere of language, whether music or art or science, military, obviously personal movement, you're moved by things, to bowel movements, it's everywhere, and it's a fundamental part of life. So I've been trying to think my way through this, to try and not to get a string theory of movement, but though I acknowledge the other, why not even aim for that there is unity, and I'm arguing that much of what is called social movement is in fact biological also. It's not only social, and it's part of the web of life of Mother Earth, but that's a separate subject which we can maybe discuss. But what I'm trying to say is that here, that there are many kinds of movements that were true then, but here we are today in a situation of connectivity, which is undreamt of at that point. We didn't even have long-distance phoning. It was dependent on switchboards that, till 91, that went from village to small town to big town to the metropolis, and then you connected across the country. It's unbelievable what is true. And of course, air travel to those of us who use it, the connectivity that it's provided. So there's a profound, profound difference in terms of instruments that are available, but conditions also in which we are working. And I think it's extremely important to do this, and not in a static sense of understanding what it is now, because within 5 years, it will be again radically different. The rate of invention of technologies and of things are moving so fast that the contextualization of what we do becomes very important. These are unfortunately long points. I'll come back to the fourth question I want to raise, big question: who are you? Who am I when I get into movement? This is something we didn't think of, I didn't think of, when in the 80s, for particularly those who are here, like Ashish and Katie and Raka, who knew me from back then. I don't think it's something we ever talked about. But today, I'm very aware that I'm male, I'm upper caste, I'm upper class, I'm foreign returned, I have a elite skill or set of skills and a kind of a cosmopolitan social capital, which is what I've used. And I used during the 70s and 80s without even being aware of it. And it brought me tremendous privilege, but it also closed doors for me or made things opaque because I didn't have access. And I was blind to that. That blindness comes with that lack of consciousness for who you are. Now, we can use, obviously, for instance, caste access, or, I'm a Bong, so I can reach out to the Bongs, or, within that to Bodyus, or whatever it is. We do this in our work. Almost unconsciously, we use these caste connections. But by doing so, we also cut out other people. And I know recently, the group, the organization I mentioned, Unnayan, we had a gathering last year, and Katie was there. And it was a wonderful experience. But in preparation for that, I had some discussions with one of the people in the group. And he told me that you were never aware that you were the boss. And because you brought in the money. I was never aware of this. And I think the thing is the lack of consciousness as you do what are otherwise apparently successful and creative activities, and to be unconscious means that actually you are blundering your way through things. So I'm asking, in everything that we do, in movement, and particularly today, where the world has changed, and I didn't mention this in the change, today, for instance, Dalits are far, far more active than they ever were before. There's a presence, there's a self-confidence, as an assertion, and they're not waiting for other castes to take the leadership. They are taking the leadership, and we have to make way. We should realize it's time to make way. But at that time, it was not that. There were, of course, experiences of that, of assertion, Dalit Panthers being the most important. But by and large, we assumed that we were the leaders. I think that situation, women were not in the condition that we are today. And I think it's extremely important we realize of one's subjective location within society, of how much this affects what one does, and how much it also cripples what you do, without realizing what you're doing. And that's part of the architecture of society, and the architecture of social action, is recognizing the objective reality that's around you, and your subjective location within that, and working through that. And I personally feel, and this isn't again the time to talk about it, that our work in the 80s would have been radically different if we were aware of who we were. We never brought that into account. Today, in movements, it is a very important part. And that's so good to see. Like, people introduce themselves. I used to be shocked when I went to Maharashtra and be asked for my caste. I hardly was aware of it. But it's very important. Okay, where are you located within this situation? Who are you? So, and obviously sexual orientation today also comes into play. So I think it's extremely important that we put this forward as part of the vocabulary. The last point I'd like to raise has to do with recognizing that in building movement, we are only we're contributing. And again, I was not conscious of that there. We tried to be a collective in Unnayan, but I think it was not the case. So here what I'd like to do is that if we can try and come back to the questions that Ashish raised, and maybe some of the issues that I've raised here, to get 4 or 5 thoughts, comments of what we'd like to focus in for the rest of this talk. And make it, in other words, participative. And I'd like if you would play the role, please, of calling on. I was suggesting if there were sort of 3 women and 3 men who speak, and who put forward, and it's only to get enough of a range, and then we take it forward from there. Probably age should come in too somewhere.
Come in, certainly. Okay, then in that case, the kind of onus comes on me, and I'll start with Aarti, being one of, because Aarti has actually done, as an architect who's working, it seems to me, rather enmeshed in social issues and things like that, rather than only technological ones. That's one, and you're young still, I hope, you know. And I guess another person would be slightly older would be yourself, I guess, who is already beginning to embark on it's kind of movement thing, isn't it? I mean, collective action with people around you. I'm not sure. I do know you, but I can't remember your name. Chandralekha. Aarti is Aarti Jingra. And that makes 2. And did you say 3 and 3? All right, yeah, it's a good number. Yeah, but I was, Meena, I've always been curious about how you feel when you come to the India Habitat Center. The design of this was a collective activity, wasn't it? In a way, because I kind of, I remember when it all started, and I used to be a regular visitor to S.K. Sharma's room, and I remember how much he influenced the whole thing. And then, it'd be very interesting to know from you about anything, but there's just a stray thought which I've had. I was thinking one of these times we should ask you to speak and be a speaker in this session, Architecture and Society, and to tell us specifically about your feelings towards the India Habitat Center. But anyway, if you would join this group of 3, and I would say that on the other side, Sabyasachi, you'll have to be the kind of older version of the other side. And you're not that old, but still.
Everyone's in the front row so far.
Oh, yeah, on the back row, you see the people are hiding in a way. So, yeah, it's all front row, you can see. Who can every volunteer then? Somebody younger. You'd like to? Yes. What is your name?
My name is
Vivek Wadia. And you are an architect?
Yeah.
Okay. Practicing or student?
Practicing
And teaching. Excellent. So and then one, perhaps, somebody a bit younger. I'm missing you, Mayank, because you're in the first row. If you were sitting in the back, I might have pointed at you. But let's see we've got somebody very young. Is there a student who would like to volunteer to be part of this discussion? There are people in the back row. I know there are several students who are there. Yeah? Anyone would like to volunteer? No, it seems that people are shy.
No, then why don't you just choose people?
Well, who is a student? Let me say, just raise your hands. The students here. No, I mean, going to college. There are people, architecture students. No, we all are for that, in that sense, but those who are admitted in a college. Okay. So one of you, you in black, since that's the preferred choice of architects. So okay. And what is your name? Ashish Pachori. Very good. So now you have 6, Joy. And
So if you could just, what I'm asking is if you could come up with issues which you, would like to see discussed here. We may not be able to take up everything, and I may not be mentally agile enough to be able to respond to everything, but at least it lays out an agenda which is in the commons. we're just sharing our thoughts about our urgent issues. In terms of the rubric of this particular meeting, which is public action by citizens, how can we build that? So issues in it, whatever. So please.
That is something that we grew up with. I grew up in Bengal, in Calcutta. Caste was never an issue, ever. And I cannot accept, as I live now, I've lived abroad for all these years, that caste matters at all. There are many other things that we can take into account, the social, the economic, education, but caste is something that you're born into. I have difficulty in accepting that it's important. It's been whipped up politically. It's been utilized. It's been thrashed in many different ways for either political reasons or to keep a certain section suppressed or to give them more opportunities. It's not, in my opinion, a factor that should be taken into account or encouraged in social activities.
Okay. Next, anybody else? Next person, either Aarti or Ina.
No, I agree with Chandralekha entirely because we grew up with not knowing what caste we belonged to. And quite frankly, I still don't know quite what my caste is. Obviously, socially, economically, I'm not at the bottom. But other than that, I don't know anything, and I don't think it should matter. I think one of the things that I feel is very important that we need to start treating everyone just as human beings. And it doesn't matter what their gender is, what their color they are, and all that. The sooner we kind of get to it, the better. And I don't know how this will ever happen, but I was just a little earlier, I was talking to Minoti, who's sitting behind me, that one thing I haven't been able to understand, like I live in Defense Colony. Kotla is right next to us. We depend on Kotla, if I may use the word, for all our domestic help. We've got the mandi there, we go to shop there. Some residents of Defense Colony also have like small scale manufacturing units that run out of Kotla. But we don't want them in our neighborhood parks. I think it's important that we sort of correct this mindset. I mean, you let them into your homes, they cook for you, you maybe get those people to massage you, so you allow them, really into a very intimate space, far more intimate than that park in the neighborhood. So, I mean, I just haven't been able to understand why that happens and how we can sort of get rid of that mindset.
I know I've had my share, but I just want to teach yoga, and when you say, who am I? It's much more than all these. It really is that energy that we carry. That's what we always explain. So that's part of our yogic philosophy, so I'm just putting it out there. I know it's not part of it, but it's very important to say, who am I? It's beyond all this.
I think it's a very important.
Okay.
I just like to add the words dignity and freedom. It kind of stems from gender from me, but I'd like to take it a step further and call it freedom.
Can I? Yes. I want to add one more dimension to the last, or maybe the first, question of who am I? I think the question of stamina is very important. It's very easy to differ when you can walk home and sleep. But it's very difficult to differ and continue the difference to its logical culmination, which ultimately takes you to take positions in the public domain. So the question that I am very concerned about is that in the face of repression, which if you are an activist you will find, not necessarily if you are on the streets, but if you were to have a difference of opinion even within your family, even within your class, even within the university, even within your peers, the kind of subtle and gross repression that you have to face, how do you stand up to that? I have known full-time activists in very, very radical mass movements who have 21 cases registered against them of rape, of murder, of arsenal, when there was nothing like that. So they are on the run. Their families are harassed at home. Not only harassed, but it's intimidation of very high order, which means the police is standing outside your house all the time. And you are tracked. Trolling is very, very minor. I mean, trolling is not as big a repression as, for example, being watched all the time, being beaten, and you have no resources to get your next meal. Now, how does an activist actually learn? And activism, I don't mean to say that you have to be part of a political party to be an activist, or you have to be a member of an NGO to be an activist. I think you're an activist the moment you begin to think critically, the moment you begin to show curiosity, the moment you begin to know questions and want to know answers to things that are not normally asked, the moment you begin to not take conventions and traditions for granted. I mean, I'll give you a small example. I was doing research in Simlipal, and I was to go and find out how the forest dwellers think of the forest. This is Simlipal Biosphere Reserve. And I was working with an NGO who gave me a permit to go into the forest, which is a biosphere reserve, and rules to get into there are very strict. Now, when I went to the gate, he says, this is not valid permission. So what option did I have? To go back to the minister and then take all the necessary permissions, which would be another 6 months. So as I was trained by my mentors, I took the decision that for the sake of knowledge, I must transgress all boundaries. As a researcher, I am trained to understand that good research is to transgress all social boundaries given to you. Otherwise, you cannot be a good researcher. So I went in, and 5 days later, the police was there after me, right in the middle of Simlipal, 25 kilometers inside, and they asked me to get out. And they said, you have to report to the police tomorrow. It gave me only 5 hours to prepare, and no villager was wanting to give me a bicycle. So I walked 30 kilometers, 3 o'clock in the morning to reach there at 9 o'clock. Now this is also a form of activism that you do, which you don't necessarily go out on the streets. So my concern is that I want to learn from everybody's experience, how do you keep the stamina alive? And the issue is very serious, because if you can't get an answer to your question, the answer is, oh, forget it. It's not worth it. How am I going to spend so much time in my life doing all this? So you need stamina to even know how to wait. And you may have to wait for 2 generations. How do you keep the question alive in your head without getting fetishized about the question? And there are many examples from which we can learn. I mean, I will not go into that, but I think there's lots to learn from several social movements on how to keep the stamina alive. If you don't have the stamina is not only physical, stamina is also to not lose your sense of reason when there is attack on who you are. So I'm concerned with when you're afraid of yourself, then you can't be an activist. And I think what repressive organizations do is they make you scared of yourself. And I think that's an important issue that I think perhaps we should all discuss.
So, this is there.
Yeah, hi, this is Ashish. I'm a 4th year architecture student. I don't know how relevant this question is in this present scenario, but as a student, I have this like observation, like like how relevant it is, uh, not only for like architects and planners to engage into a particular city while designing, and how important it is to even educate people, or for that matter, maybe engage the public participation in a system that they know from where they're coming from. For that matter, if I take an example, like I come from Agra, and the people there, they are not aware of the history that the Agra have. I mean, the city sort of expanded from the river Yamuna, and then it just goes both ways. But I think when I go back into the city, it just becomes very important for me that how people are. How if we can if people can engage in, or maybe they can understand from where they're coming from, and if we can create some communes which allow them to engage into this sort of uh, you know maybe taught them, not even teach them, maybe I don't know, maybe I mean this is a observation that I had. Maybe we can work both ways. I mean, also the architects and the planners, but also we can formalize some communes and groups which engage public participation in order to tell the history or the beauty of the city. Thank you.
Yeah. One of my concerns right now, when I'm doing teaching architecture, or when I'm practicing architecture, is that what I see is that there is no thoughtful way of putting the things or doing the architecture of a particular place of a particular time. Like for instance, we say that glass buildings are very bad, okay? And but most of the people, if you see in common people in India, they like that building very much. Even your parents, like my parents, will be agreeing to the fact that these buildings are very grateful. But there is no thought that has been put in that whether it's relevant, or whether that kind of thought space is really worth, or that kind of envelope or skin in terms of architecture is really relevant to architecture of this place or some other place. So that's the concern, that really there is no thought behind the steps that any architecture or a planner or a urban designer is that thoughtfulness, or thinking that should be done in a thoughtful way is lacking in our practices. That's what I feel, and I really want that thing to be changed and create an awareness among the common people for that.
Well, I'm there. I don't think there's perhaps a need to summarize again. I think but for me, it seems to me that there's some very important issues that are rising here. And the last two comments, in a sense, are related. One's asking, the relevance of, you were stumbling around the words of educating, teaching. You weren't quite sure how to say it. But the spirit was important. Like, in other words, involving quote-unquote ordinary people in this, and building a consciousness, use word communes, to take forward, in other words, participation in issues that, in this case, concern the history of Agra or wherever, and this similarly issues of a more critical understanding of technologies that are used. And so, there is probably an association of modernity, and for people who are stuck in terms of their lives, they admire simple symbols. But you're arguing that we have the capacity to open up these questions, and to get a more sensitive, ecological way of looking at buildings, to re-understand buildings. What can be our role? So, in a way, I see them as related. But I think this is I asked this partly, I went through this, partly just simply to surface ideas, not that it's a defining agenda, but that we have this range of concerns. Obviously, the first two, which had to do partly, not, well, in objection, in a sense, my highlighting of caste. My point, and I just want to clarify there, was not to put it forward that we need to caste identify, but the fact is that those of us who are unaware of what caste, in fact, we use those caste connections. Others also use that. They can read it. And we tread that path whether we like it or not. And class connections, whether we like it or not. So I think it's important to be aware of it, even to avoid it, or even to be able to address it. You need to become aware of it. I don't think by not talking, for instance, Bengal being case in point, Bengalis like to think there's no caste, but it's riddled with caste as a society. And and it's unfortunately, it's in my experience, that a lot of the violence, which was often portrayed as class violence, was often caste violence. And I think it's very important to come into terms for those of us particularly, and I think why it comes out for me is because I was similarly brought up, not being aware of it, not knowing where I belonged or how it fit. But when I look back, I see it's such a play. So it wasn't a plea for including it, but for being conscious of who you are, and then to tread strategically and to move and know that others may think about it, and it's how you receive. But anyway, I hear you, and it sounded as I was propagating there was a need for an aggressive statement. It wasn't that. It was to become conscious of it ourselves. But anyway, I think it's important for me, it's been important to get these kind of concerns that are here. These aren't necessarily, as I said, the only defining issues. If we do have a follow-up session, we can perhaps, not through online blogging or participating, but I think by sitting and talking, can tease out what would be the key issues which we want to take forward. Meanwhile, some of these, I think, can come forward in the discussion that will go on. So I'm going to carry forward and try and raise a couple of questions. What Ashish put it to us, as he posed the question of public action, which is an interesting term insofar as that it's evident enough of effectively private individuals coming out in public and taking positions. I was trying to think back on this, and those like Sabyasachi and others who may have studied this, I was realizing that, to my understanding, there's much less attention that's been paid to such things. It tends to be, and even you saw me as being involved with movements and campaigns. So those are the categories that come forward in the sense of coherent understanding, but coherent descriptions of public action, if you like. So I thought that one thing that would be useful is to talk about movement and campaign a bit, in terms of of what they are. And I think this is, I feel this is important because again, I think we use these terms without necessarily engaging with them critically. And I think that it's important to do so between ourselves. The word movement, for instance, is a term, it tends to refer to, social or political movement or people's movement, popular movement. But as I said, it's something that is, I believe, connected with movements in other parts of life. That what is it that moves people to get involved in a social movement? What is it that moves us to join spontaneous protests that are taking place in terms of the assault on women in particular has been most important, but at another level in support of, in protest against lynchings that have taken place, etc. These are real things, and these are things that move us to take public action. Broadly speaking, a movement is, if you like, a relatively conscious, organized body of opinions that's shared by a smaller or larger number of people, group of people, which they then take systematic steps to propagate. And they build a systematic structure. This isn't a textbook description. I'm trying to use ordinary language to describe what I think takes place. there are, as I said, movements that are not organized bodies. The Me Too movement is a case in point. These are swells that take place of a protest that resonates with others who then build the courage to come out, and it becomes a movement by virtue of collective action, that collective expression. And it takes courage to do that, to come out in the open and be willing to be face in the Me Too movement others, knowing what they have been through, and bearing yourself, if you like, in public. But so, I mean, some examples. The Me Too movement is a case in point. I think many of you know it's not an organized pressure group. But it's very organized. It's become increasingly organized, increasingly strategic. And so I think it's important to understand that. This, again, isn't the time to talk about it, but this is a case in point. A second kind of movement is a more classical movement, such like the Narmada Bachao Andolan, and there have been others, which have grown through the efforts of individuals, who generally activists, often coming from outside, who organize people. They can see, in the case of the Narmada campaigns or movements, it was, they could see. Is everyone aware of the Narmada Bachao Andolan, more or less? Yeah, I think that most people will probably know of it. It started in about 84, 85, when Medha went down to the valley, and then she stitched together existing protest actions in 3 states, and ultimately this came out 6 years later as a movement. But in the course of that also did what 1 or 2 people asked, was a question of involving local people as opposed to well-meaning socialists, well-meaning communists, well-meaning whoever, who were leading processes and who set up organizations, in fact led the people. In this case, Medha comes from a different tradition, and she was joined by others to actually involve in working, in talking with the Patidars on the one hand, and with the Bhils, who were historically on 2 very radically opposite sides of the fence, and where the Patidars exploited the Bhils, but to bring them together on a common platform against something that was a common oppression, which was the devastation of their lands, livelihoods, and futures. So I think it's one of the great historic achievements there, of bringing what had been hundreds of years of enmity, opposition, and of oppression, and being, to some degree at least, build a common platform, as well as with other sections of society. But I think that was a very conscious case, where she was joined by other activists, and then other solidarity action from outside, and it became not only in the Narmada Valley, but across the country, and in fact there was a very major international campaign of solidarity with that. So it grows. So that's another kind of much more organized, systematic, and if you listen, for instance, someone like Sripad Dharmadhikari, one of the key strategists, it's extraordinary, the vocabulary of tactics that they developed and conceptualized as they work. In fact, that history has never really been properly written up, how rich it has been and how much it has contributed much more widely. Third is there's something like, which is still emerging, the Bhim Army, which is taking shape. And here you have a different situation of a section of society. It doesn't have to be then. There are Adivasi groups of that kind. Obviously, women's movements have been there, agricultural movement. There are many of this kind, when choosing one, where the articulation of resistance has come from within the particular group. And the vocabulary, the articulation, the vocabulary of resistance, and the grammar of resistance, the timing, everything has come from them, as opposed to from outside. And there are other young, very strategic Dalits also now, who are playing this kind of role in different parts of the country. So you're seeing we are seeing in our times the emergence of a new phase of movement, but of independence. Now, I'm saying that these are 3 different kinds of movements. The actors are different, the leadership, the people, the kinds of action they take. For instance, in the Narmada case, Medha, as well as all the other activists, I don't want to feature her alone, there are many who were involved in this, were involved in building these cross-caste, cross-ethnic solidarities in the Narmada Valley, which has been, I think, one of the most extraordinary social initiatives. So now, what I'm trying to bring forward here is that a campaign is not quite the same sort of thing. A campaign generally is, by and large, I think campaigns have been, and I may be very wrong and I'd be glad to be corrected, tends to involve fewer people, tends to involve, it be primarily led by middle and upper class people who articulate particular ideas and build a platform around that to put forward the kind of public action that I think that has tended to dominate our imagination of protesting, well, for instance, the demolition of historic buildings or of trees or of the despoilation of the environment. These campaigns have a very particular character. They are not necessarily participative in the sense of drawing a broad base. They're not necessarily educative in terms of their nature. And I think that raises a question for me, and I would say this is something that in the National Campaign for Housing Rights, we in fact crossed that boundary. A lot of our time was spent in terms of the educational side of things, of trying to build up people's own articulation of what they thought and to build common ideas through there. But by and large, campaigns have not done this and don't do this. So I think that raises why I try and to contrast movements and campaigns, is that I think that campaigns have a lot to learn from movements in terms of building a wider structure, but also building, to use a loaded term, a more democratic approach, a shared, a commune, to use that term, of opinion. And moving forward, campaigns tend to be shorter term and shorter lived. So the issue, the stamina issue you brought up, for instance, I think it tends to elide. It does, because it depends more on a few people. Now, I don't know if this very kind of comic book illustrative definition or description is of any use to you, but I think that it's important to realize the strengths and weaknesses of the two. These are two very different modes of action. Campaigns have shorter life, harder burst, to try and achieve particular goals. Movements tend to be much longer sustained thing with broader range of social goals. They're much more difficult to sustain, and they, in terms of also the complexity of leadership and structure, they experience. But I think there's two very different vocabularies that are available to people who want to build, do public action. And I think that that's something that in moving forward, it's extremely important to keep in mind. What is it that you want to do? You have, I mean, there are choices that have to be made. I think one can bumble into, without knowing what one's doing, into a campaign, when in fact what you needed was a broader based movement. I mean, I think that there are many issues where this applies. For instance, in the, well, one of the things the Greha has dealt with, the regularization of unauthorized colonies. It's possible to do this in a process which is top-down, which is of well-meaning individuals, very informed, trying to influence public policy through the Governor General or the Chief Minister or whatever it is, and try and get things implemented. I've seen this happening in the last 10, 15 years in Delhi, versus a situation of building up a broad-based understanding of how people want to improve their sanitation, their water supply, and as well as the regularization. And it becomes, in a sense, of self-governance. So the two are very different. So I think that's important to put that forward. And I wondered whether this, and I just want to say that I think that this needs to be put again in the context of what I was trying to point out earlier, the times in which we live. And in Delhi's case, it seems to me, unlike like those of us who work in Calcutta, where it's a somewhat simplest, well, there's two levels of government. Here you have three levels of government, and the federal government or the central government playing a very critical role in terms of what the city is as a whole and holding many of the powers to itself. So again, the complexity of doing things.